December 1805. Outside the village of Austerlitz, Moravia. The air was thick with frost and the smell of gunpowder. Morning mist curled like spectral fingers around dead horses, shattered cannons, and frozen men with their eyes still open. It was the day after victory, Napoleon's finest yet. The Battle of Austerlitz had been a gamble, and by all logic, it should have failed. The French had lured a larger Russian-Austrian army into a trap, but not even Napoleon's own generals fully understood how precisely he had predicted their movements. Inside a damp, fire-lit command tent perched on a rocky rise, the emperor sat in silence, reviewing dispatches with half a mind. The other half listened to the breathing in the corner, the faint scrape of bare feet against stone, and the soft sound of a tongue pressing against sharp teeth. She stepped into view like smoke. Velina. She wore a crimson sash tied around a simple black cloak, her face pale and ageless, with eyes that glimmered like wine in candlelight. Her hands were stained with dried blood, some French, some enemy, and her lips twitched with a restrained hunger. But Napoleon did not flinch. He gestured to a low stool beside the map table. "Tell me what you saw." Velina knelt instead of sitting. "The Prussian envoy will delay 2 days. You'll receive his letter on the 6th. Talleyrand's second courier will be intercepted, but the Austrian line at Brunn is cracked. You'll break it within a week." Napoleon narrowed his gaze. "How many did you drink last night?" 3 dying officers. 1 French. 2 Russians. All fresh." She licked a smear from her wrist. "The Frenchman died with your name on his tongue. The Russian was vague, but the blood burned with fear. There's talk of an Eastern god of death. Something buried in the cold." Napoleon nodded, unconcerned. "That's myth, and I have no intention of marching further east than I must. Tell me what matters." "The next move." Velina's voice dipped to a whisper. "You have 4 weeks before the snow walls you in. You must strike Vienna again. Fast. The Habsburgs are calling for aid from the north. Cut them before they link hands." He leaned forward. "Then I'll need to bleed the land harder." "You always do." A long silence stretched between them. Only the crackle of the fire and the distant cough of a soldier broke it. Then Napoleon pulled a leather-bound journal from his coat, flipping to a page scrawled with blooded ink. He tapped it. "Why does it work, Velina?" "Your visions. I've never known any prophet to speak so clearly. You don't see the future. You taste it. I taste what others saw in their final thoughts. Their minds unlocked as the body dies. It's a curse and a gift. But you must understand," she said, her voice growing tight. "This power is not clean. The more I drink, the deeper I go. There are wells beneath the mind, Napoleon. Deep ones. And something waits at the bottom. You're not the only one with nightmares." He rose, towering over her with that magnetic calm, his hands clasped behind his back like a statue carved by force of will. Then, slowly, he turned to her. "I need more. For the next campaign, Austerlitz will be legend, but I want empires to tremble before the idea of me." Velina met his gaze. "And what will you trade, Emperor?" Napoleon didn't hesitate. He extended his wrist. "A blood oath," he said. "If you guide me through the next 3 winters, I give you sanctuary. No church will hunt you. No general will question your presence. In exchange, I win my empire." Velina's eyes narrowed, not with distrust, but calculation. "You understand what that means. You'll be bound to me. Not just in blood, in fate. You'll see things no man should. Smell the death of your men before the bullets fly. Hear voices in the dark, and you will march toward something no crown can protect you from." He smirked. "I already hear voices. They call me Emperor." She took his wrist with fingers like silk over bone. Her fangs extended, not comically, not dramatically, but as if they had always been part of her mouth and simply waited for the moment to show themselves. Napoleon didn't wince as they pierced his flesh. As she drank, her eyes rolled back and her spine arched. Images fluttered through her mind, burning cities, kneeling soldiers, a crown of ash, a throne of ice. But one vision dominated. A black mountain range under red auroras, where something ancient stirred beneath a seal etched in runes older than the Bible. Velina pulled back, gasping. "It begins." "What begins?" She didn't answer. Not yet. Her body was shaking. Napoleon stepped back, wiping blood from his wrist and reaching for a clean cloth. "Write it down. Everything you saw." "I will," she whispered, still trembling. "But you must know, this victory opened something. Not just for France. For the world. The battlefield screamed last night, and I heard someone answer from far, far away." Napoleon's expression darkened. "Another vampire?" Valina's gaze drifted toward the tent flap, as if she saw through the fabric, past the hills and snow, into something buried deep. "Not like me. Not civilized. The old warlords. The ash-blooded. They dream beneath the Ural Mountains. And dreams spread." He rolled up the map. "Then we won't go east." "You will," she said quietly. "History already wrote that line. The only choice left is who survives to read it." Outside the tent, the French camp bustled with quiet celebration. Field surgeons shouting for gauze, troops polishing muskets, and lieutenants scribbling letters home. But no one noticed the small pool of blood at the base of the Emperor's hilltop. It hadn't come from a soldier. It hadn't come from battle. It was the first drop spilled in a far older war. A war that would follow him across frost and forest until the Red March reached the edge of the world and woke it. Spring, 1806, French-occupied Prussia. Rain fell constantly, fat drops that carried the stench of scorched timber and iron blood. Roads became rivers. Graves turned to mud. Villages emptied before the French advance, not out of loyalty to the Prussian crown, but out of something older, fear. Napoleon rode ahead of his men. He no longer waited for scouts. He no longer questioned fort positions, enemy supply chains, or the weather. He simply knew, with unnatural certainty, he would halt the army just before a storm, flank a regiment hidden by hills, or anticipate a surrender by days. The generals praised him. The soldiers worshipped him. And yet, in the command tent, behind the flickering candlelight and maps soaked in red ink, only Marshal Berthier dared ask the question, "Who whispers to you, sire?" Napoleon didn't answer. He turned to Valina, standing barefoot near the tent's edge. Her eyes were black-rimmed, sunken from days without rest, and her lips no longer concealed her fangs. She was losing the war against her hunger. "It is not whispering," Napoleon said at last. "It is certainty. A thing men call instinct, but which lives in her veins." Valina smiled weakly. "Not certainty. Only fragments. Dying minds speak in riddles." Berthier clenched his fists. "Then whose blood bought today's forecast? An ally? A child?" Napoleon's gaze sharpened. "You presume too much." "No, sire. I fear too much." Valina spoke softly. It was a Prussian general. He crawled from his horse, shattered spine, trying to reach his son. He died with the city of Jena in his throat. Now we know it will fall before the month ends." Berthier paled. "And this is how you plan to win Europe?" "No," Napoleon replied. "This is how I plan to end war." Valina said nothing. Her breath steamed in the cold air, though she hadn't drawn a real breath in centuries. They moved swiftly through the continent, faster than any army should have. Scouts often returned to find the town already burning, the enemy line already broken. Victory blurred into victory, until even the veterans stopped asking how Napoleon knew everything. He did not just outmaneuver the enemy. He outthought time itself. But the cost grew. Valina was drinking more. Each battle required new blood, officers, prisoners, even the wounded French who wouldn't survive the night. The surgeons whispered of men vanishing from field hospitals. The campfires at night began to burn lower, the laughter more forced, the silences more frequent. She no longer asked for permission. By Dresden, Valina had grown pale as snow, but her voice carried a strange music, like a hymn half-remembered from a dream. "Something is moving." Napoleon, seated before a fire in his field tent, barely looked up. "What now?" "I don't know. It's not a vision. It's an echo. The deeper I drink, the more I hear, voices not tied to the dying. Something beneath. Something frozen." "You're just tired," he said. "The East has old ghosts. Ignore them." "Ignore them?" She laughed, a dry, splintering sound. "You don't ignore wolves when you hear them howling at your border. These are ancient, Napoleon. I taste their silence like rotting clean water." He paused, setting down his wine. "What do they want?" "To be remembered. That night, In a castle taken outside Warsaw, Valina fed again, this time from a Russian noble who'd poisoned himself before capture. His blood revealed a secret. Russian command was retreating faster than they admitted. They feared something Napoleon's army hadn't yet seen, something more than his artillery. A whisper was spreading across enemy lines, not of battles lost, but of a pact. The French ride with a pale witch, prisoners said. She drinks our dying and sees through the fog. They were right. But what no one knew, what even Valina hadn't told the emperor, was that her visions had begun to fracture. For every correct prediction, another spiraled out of control. Cities she said would stand fell in fire. Soldiers she warned would perish came back unscathed. Blood was no longer enough. There was interference. Something was waking. Weeks later, outside Minsk, a French scouting patrol returned with torn bodies and wide eyes. No Russians. No rebels. Just bloodless corpses, eyes frozen in terror, and horses skinned but untouched by predators. Napoleon inspected them personally. These are surgical removals, he muttered. Not wolves. Not men. Valina arrived an hour later, breathless, though she did not breathe. It has begun, she said. They are testing the edge of the world. Who? Valina closed her eyes. The ones buried before language. The ash-blooded princes. I tasted them in the general's blood back in Austerlitz. But now, I feel them in the soil. They are older than kingdoms, and they remember their wars. Napoleon stood motionless. Then he turned to Berthier and ordered the camp moved west, just slightly. Not a retreat, never that, but a shift. A tactical pause. Valina noticed. You're afraid. I'm cautious. You never were before. Before, he said slowly. The dead weren't biting back. Later, alone with Valina under the shadow of an ancient pine forest, he asked her one question. What happens if we wake them? She did not hesitate. They will remember what empires taste like. The army pressed on, but the victories were less clean. The Russians began abandoning cities and burning them behind them. Scouts vanished. Snow came early, though no one could explain why. At night, Valina began muttering in languages long dead. Her dreams became screams. And each time she fed, her eyes lingered longer on the emperor. You're not sleeping, she said one night. Don't need to. That's a lie. Napoleon stared into the fire. They're close, aren't they? Yes, under the Ural Mountains. And they are listening. To what? To your hunger. The generals began to grumble. Some whispered of a priest who had spoken against Valina and was found with his throat torn out. Others claimed the emperor no longer strategized. He channeled. One lieutenant swore he saw Valina walking through a battlefield untouched, her feet leaving no mark in the snow. Napoleon ignored it all. He was still winning. But inside, something else was growing. Not doubt. Not fear. Hunger. He no longer sought to dominate Europe. He wanted to see what lay at the edge of his power. He wanted to break the world and remake it in the shape of his will. And perhaps, somewhere beneath the ancient ice, there were others who had tried. Perhaps they would understand. Late autumn, 1806, western foothills of the Ural Mountains. The trees were dying before the frost. Black veins climbed birch trunks. Mushrooms bloomed in unnatural patterns, perfect rings, perfect spacing, as if something underground was breathing. The French troops noticed it. Horses refused to enter certain clearings. Fires wouldn't catch in others, and no birds had been heard for days. Napoleon rode through it all in silence. Beside him, Valina walked barefoot through snow, her cloak trailing like spilled ink. She had stopped drinking for 2 days, not out of mercy, but instinct. She no longer needed to taste the blood of dying men. Visions came now like seizures, unbidden and wild. There are things underfoot, she whispered, eyes wide as frost rimmed her lashes. Bones, yes, but more. Intentions. They remember. Napoleon didn't look at her. He studied the terrain ahead, a slope that dropped into a ravine where mist refused to lift. They buried them here, didn't they? He said softly. Valina nodded. Not buried. Sealed. In the newly occupied town of Solikamsk, locals refused to leave their homes after dark. When French soldiers ordered them out, they wailed and clutched amulets of iron, birch bark, and dried garlic. The children spoke of pale men in the hills, eyes like coals and mouths that never moved, watching from behind snow-laced rocks. One boy offered a name. Chervian. Velina paled. That name hasn't been spoken in 6 centuries, she said. Who was he? Napoleon asked. Not was. Is. A warlord. Vampire king of the eastern steppes. The Slavic tribes made pacts with witches, just to chain him beneath the Ural ice. They called him ash-blooded because his veins ran cold after 1,000 kills. When he fed, entire villages vanished. And he's waking up? Velina nodded slowly. He's listening first. To us. That night, in a hastily fortified monastery, Velina painted symbols in goat's blood across the walls. French engineers mocked her, until 3 of them were found in the chapel, teeth missing, eyes frozen open, hearts exploded outward as if sucked from within. Napoleon ordered silence. We say nothing of this. No panic. We observe. We document. We advance. Velina hissed. You want to study them? I want to understand the thing I'm about to destroy. Destroy? She laughed bitterly. Napoleon, you don't destroy a mountain. You don't kill a plague by staring at it through a telescope. You run. But you were never meant to retreat, were you? No, he said simply. I wasn't. 2 days later, scouts discovered a hilltop shrine sealed behind iron gates, bound in rusted chains thicker than a man's wrist. The air above it shimmered faintly, like heat over sand, though the ground was bitter cold. Velina refused to approach. I can't hear myself near it. It's like the air cancels thought. Napoleon stepped closer. The chains began to hum. The snow retreated from the iron gate as if afraid. Strange glyphs were etched into the stone, symbols that did not belong to any known language, but felt old in the marrow of the viewer's bones. Then he saw it, a face carved into the stone slab, lips open in a scream, eyes hollow, fangs barely visible. Beneath it, a single phrase had been scratched in a more recent hand, shaky, hurried. Do not wake what remembers. Napoleon touched the iron with his gloved hand. A pulse shot through the stone. A heartbeat. Not human. That night, Velina woke screaming. They saw me, she gasped. I was dreaming, and they turned. All of them. Thousands. Beneath ice. Lined like sarcophagi. And they turned their heads. To what? To me. She began to convulse, falling to the floor. Her mouth bled. Her eyes rolled back. Napoleon knelt beside her, trying to hold her still, but her skin was hot, blistering with heat from something inside her. Then she whispered, They remember you. A day later, French troops discovered a buried door beneath a collapsed mineshaft, hidden behind layers of salt, silver dust, and human bones placed like charms. Velina begged Napoleon not to enter. You're not facing a relic, Napoleon. You're facing the first war. The war before memory. These are beings that conquered the cold before we knew how to make fire. They drink intent. They drink ambition. That's why they hear you. Napoleon stared at the sealed door. Then let them come. Velina fled that night. No one saw her leave. No trail. No prints. No scent. Only a single red rose placed beside Napoleon's traveling case, dried, brittle, with the stem bitten clean in half. In her absence, Napoleon changed. He stopped sleeping altogether. He no longer trusted his generals. He wrote in strange shorthand. He began sketching unfamiliar architecture, towers made of bone, cities sunk beneath ice, vast halls carved into black glaciers. His journal mentioned a name more and more frequently, Chervian, and always in the same sentence as his own. In the high peaks near Mount Nerednea, the French army made camp. The weather shifted that night. Not storm, not wind, silence, a complete, smothering quiet. No breath of air, no crunch of snow. Even the fire refused to crackle. That's when the first soldier disappeared. Then another, and another. No blood, no sound, only discarded weapons and half-sunken boot prints vanishing into nothing. By dawn, 36 men were gone. Napoleon didn't blink. He merely ordered the camp moved closer to the frozen ridge. They found a chamber entrance 3 days later, carved into the side of the mountain like a wound. It pulsed with warmth, despite the sub-zero air. Symbols burned faintly in the rock, glowing just beneath the surface. Valina's words echoed in his mind. You're not waking them. You're joining them. He entered alone. Inside, beneath hundreds of feet of frost-laced stone, the Emperor of France stood before a colossal black door. It was not made of wood or metal. It looked grown, like something ossified into shape over millennia. He placed his hand on the center. The door vibrated. His blood ran hot. And somewhere, deep beyond it, something shifted. When Napoleon returned to the surface, his eyes were bloodshot, his voice lower. He walked slower, but with gravity. Men said he left footprints where there was no snow. And that night, he issued a single command. East. We march east. But sire, Berthier began. Napoleon didn't look back. They have invited us. Early winter, 1806, base of Mount Nerednaya, Ural Mountains. The cold had grown intelligent. It no longer numbed fingers or stiffened bones. It slithered. Through coats. Into lungs. Beneath skin. It crawled in silence, like a thought you couldn't shake. French soldiers muttered prayers through chattering teeth as they marched toward the black spires of the Ural Range. The wind didn't howl. It whispered names. Names none of them remembered learning. Names like Chervian. Names like Vladek the Hollow, Sorin the Latch-Eyed, and Amaranth the Pale Hammer. The men thought they were hearing stories. Until they weren't. By the time the first snowstorm hit, Napoleon's army was down to 6,000. Frostbite had claimed the weakest. Strange disappearances, always quiet, always at night, thinned their ranks further. The guards stopped reporting the missing. The emperor no longer asked. He only looked to the peak, to the carved entrance glowing faintly with orange light that hadn't been there days before. Inside his tent, lit by coal and oil, Napoleon studied his own maps, only now they were drawn on hide, not paper. Not animal hide, either. The texture was wrong. The ink shined faintly in the dark, lines moving slightly when not watched. His generals refused to enter his tent. They said something had changed. His scent, his presence, his silence. Berthier stood outside the flap with a report in hand, but couldn't bring himself to go in. That's when he noticed it. On the frozen ground beside the emperor's tent, bare footprints. Thin, long, unnatural. Five-toed, but not human. Clawed at the tip. Leading into the tent. No one saw them emerge. On the fourth night at the mountain's base, it happened. The tremor. It began as a vibration in the snow. Too low for the ear, but strong enough to rattle bones. Horses went mad, pulling loose from reins and running into the dark. Muskets misfired in their racks. Campfires exploded upward as if punched from below. The men gathered, rifles shaking in their hands. And then, with a crack like the earth being exhaled, a sound bloomed across the ice. Boom, boom, boom. Like a war drum played slowly. But not from above. From beneath. Napoleon stood unmoving in the center of camp, eyes locked on the mountainside. His lips moved, but no one heard what he said. He began to walk. Up the slope. Toward the carved entrance. None dared approach. Soldiers shouted. Berthier reached for him. Napoleon raised one hand. Everyone stopped. At the gate, Napoleon passed through the warm glow. The frost melted before him. No guards followed. Not even his shadow remained. Only the wind, curling up the cliff behind him like a snake. Inside, the corridor pulsed, walls of black stone, breathing. That's what it felt like. Breathing. Moisture clung to every surface. Symbols glimmered like eyes watching from under skin. At the far end, a door awaited. A slab of fused metal and bone, sealed with bolts the size of cannons, covered in ancient blood that hadn't dried. This was no tomb. This was a prison. And yet it opened. Not with tools. Not with force. But when Napoleon touched it, it yielded. The stone wept. The sigils flared. The bolts retracted with groans of ancient machinery. Something on the other side moved. The emperor stepped through. Below the mountain, in the chamber carved before recorded history, they stood. 7 sarcophagi, each over 12 feet tall, forged from obsidian and fused silver, lined in thorns, adorned with skulls, human, animal, unrecognizable. One was cracked, the lid pushed outward. Napoleon smiled. Ash-blooded Chervian. His voice echoed like a hymn. I have come to wake you. The lid groaned. Dust spilled like smoke. A clawed hand gripped the edge. Then another. Then a head emerged, bald, smooth, angular. Skin like dark pearl. No eyes. Only a vertical slit where the face should be. Pulsing red. And when it opened its mouth, it spoke, not in sound, but directly into Napoleon's thoughts. Bloodborne king. You dream too loudly. Napoleon knelt. Rise. Behind him, the other sarcophagi stirred. One by one. Not opened, they unfolded, like cocoons splitting. Ash poured onto the ground. The air grew sharp. Even without movement, they radiated strength, memory. War made flesh. Each one whispered. Each one knew him. We drank empires before your sun learned to shine. You carry the scent of the pale seer. You broke the seal of 7 with mortal blood. Then Chervian, tallest of them all, stepped forward and knelt to Napoleon. What would you have of us? Outside, the world changed. Berthier saw it first. Stars above the peak began spinning, not moving, spinning in place, like they were being pulled by a vortex no one else could see. The snow on the slopes blackened. The wind carried voices. Some were French. Some were Slavic. Some were not language at all. Then came the beam, a pillar of crimson light that blasted from the mountain summit straight into the clouds, burning a line through the sky that didn't fade. Thunder cracked across the Urals. Every bird for 100 leagues took flight and never returned. And then Napoleon emerged, but not alone. Behind him marched the ash-blooded princes. Eyes like furnaces, armor of bone and obsidian, blades that sang when drawn. Their presence made men drop to their knees, weep, vomit. Some clawed at their faces and begged forgiveness for sins they hadn't yet committed. Napoleon raised his hand. His army obeyed. Berthier, trembling, took a step forward. Sire, what have you done? Napoleon turned. His eyes were the same. And not, I have ended the age of silence. Velina watched it all from a cliff far above, shrouded in wolf fur and regret. She had followed the dreamlines here, though every instinct had screamed to run. She had seen the sarcophagi open before, centuries ago, in fragments of visions she never told him about. This wasn't prophecy anymore. It was memory, and it was loose. Winter, 1806, somewhere between the Ural Mountains and Smolensk. The snows turned red before the French turned back. It was not blood, not at first, but ash. Ash that fell like snow, choking rivers, frosting branches, turning every white peak into a smoldering grave marker. The ash-blooded had awakened, and the world was adjusting. And when they marched, the earth forgot how to breathe. At first, the French soldiers called them allies. They didn't question the towering obsidian-armored giants moving silently through the ranks. They ignored how trees blackened in their footsteps, how wolves fled without howling. Even when muskets misfired within 10 feet of the ash-blooded, even when compasses spun and men dreamt of dying before they slept, no one spoke aloud, because Napoleon walked with them, and his shadow no longer moved like theirs. In Smolensk, they made their first display. A Russian garrison, nearly 10,000 strong, prepared to defend the city with cannon-lined ramparts and bitter cold. But they never fired shot. The ash-blooded did not break the walls. They walked through them, stone dissolving like sugar, wood bursting into flame where their hands passed. One soldier described it as being forgotten by God. Within minutes, silence reigned. No screams, no survivors, only crows circling over buildings that pulsed faintly with red veins. Napoleon stood at the gates that night, staring into the hollow shell of what had once been a city. Berthier approached him again. Fewer generals remained now. Fewer dared speak. Sire, Berthier said quietly, Europe is watching. Even France is watching. What are we becoming? Napoleon didn't turn. His cloak rippled in wind that smelled like copper and roses. Europe will forget, but the earth will remember its master. Berthier lowered his eyes. And if the ash-blooded remember their empire? They have one now, Napoleon replied. But Velina, watching from the shadows, just beyond torchlight, knew the truth. They weren't marching with Napoleon. They were marching through him. The further west they moved, the stranger the sky became. Constellations disappeared. The moon no longer rose in the east, but hovered, unmoving, casting an ever-dim silver over the landscape. Time warped. Entire units found themselves waking in cities they hadn't yet reached. Others aged overnight. Babies stopped crying. Dogs stopped barking. The rhythm of reality had changed. Because Chervian was not simply a warlord. He was a wound in time. And he had been opened. It wasn't long before the ash-blooded turned. Not against Napoleon. Not yet. But they began claiming sanctuary cities. Minsk, Vilnius, Riga, each declared sacred ground by the ash-blooded. Their people gone. Their walls covered in bone carvings, depicting wars that had never happened. Strange dialects returned, dead tongues spoken fluently by the possessed. One priest went mad after reading from a stele that hadn't been there the day before. His final words, "We are not marching forward, we are marching back." Napoleon began to feel it too. The whispers. He had always heard them. Velina's predictions, the cries of dying men in her blood, the murmurs of ambition like a tide behind his mind. But now they roared. Thousands of voices. Battle chants. Laughter. Screams sung in reverse. The language of things buried too deep to die properly. They invaded his sleep when he slept. They invaded his waking thoughts. Maps no longer made sense. He started drawing spirals. Endless spirals. Always turning back toward one word, empreinte. A word not in French. Not in Latin. A word from before. He didn't know what it meant. But Chervian whispered it with reverence. Then came Brest-Litovsk, the tipping point. An entire French battalion stationed in the woods outside the city vanished without a trace, save for their teeth, piled neatly in the center of camp. Chervian offered no explanation. Napoleon demanded one. Chervian turned to him for the first time in days. They began to question. Flesh that doubts cannot carry thrones. Napoleon raised his voice. I gave you a warpath, not dominion. Chervian simply smiled. You opened the tomb. You walked into our dream. That night, Napoleon ordered a retreat. He told the generals it was tactical repositioning. But Velina, who reappeared in his tent that same night, pale and furious, called it by its true name. You're running. He didn't answer. He couldn't look at her. The light of the candle made her skin ripple. I warned you, she whispered. You thought you were their master. But you're just the first drop of blood after a long thirst. Napoleon looked up. Then help me stop them. She laughed, a broken, bitter sound. I was your help. The retreat turned into a rout. What remained of the French army, now less than 3,000, was harried by shadow. Not chased, not attacked. Harvested. Men woke up without memories. Others turned on their friends, screaming about dreams of fire and bone. One entire unit was found kneeling in a frozen lake, drowned without breaking the ice. Every mile west, the ash-blooded grew stronger, because now they had names again. Names whispered by terrified villagers. Names carved into stone by trembling priests. And most of all, names sung by the dying. By the time Napoleon crossed into Poland, he was alone. No soldiers. No banners. Just him. And the red sky. At a monastery outside Krakow, he wrote a final letter, sealed in wax, locked in a lead box, and buried beneath the chapel's altar. The monks who found it decades later opened it only once. Inside, the parchment read, Europe will fall when the Urals bleed. I merely opened the first vein. Forgive me. And they buried him quietly. No fanfare. No crown. A body wrapped in cold linens, entombed beneath stone and salt. Not in France. Not in exile. But somewhere between. A grave that neither East nor West could claim. Just as he had become something neither man nor monster. And the ash-blooded, they did not conquer. They simply walked. Out of the Urals. Into the night. Until only silence remained. The kind of silence you feel in your blood.